No Man's Sky is the least stable game we've worked on in years. Normally when games are somehow unstable, it's at least predictable or consistent in the behavior of that instability. With No Man's Sky, we're seeing frame drops that are spurious and unpredictable, a fact that results in such severe stuttering that by extension, the game is not only unplayable, but also impossible to accurately benchmark. And we've generated a few sets of benchmark data on the Titan XP, the Pascal card. Thank you to Sam, one of our viewers, for that. And also tested on a 980 Ti just to make sure it wasn't an architectural thing or a driver thing with the XP. And then we tested again on an RX 480 to give a more mainstream and also a look at AMD performance. So these three cards give us a pretty wide berth of coverage with No Man's Sky in terms of performance, driver sets, architectures, three different architectures, three different driver sets, and we still had instability across the board. This isn't an instance where we can just test anyway and produce the charts and see what it looks like, because the frame rate is so varied that you would actually end up with cards that really make no sense hierarchically. It's definitely within reason that a Titan X Pascal could be outpaced by something like a 980 or a 980 Ti or whatever, or that an RX 480 could be outpaced by an RX 470. Now, why would that happen? The reason is because of the way the frame drops work, and you can watch our What is a 1% Low video for that, but because of the way frame drops work, they drag down the average so hard and they're unpredictable, so it's not like this happens necessarily every single test run, that the result is cards, even between average to test passes, will just really almost randomly and chaotically fall on the chart. So there's no valid reason to benchmark cards against one another if they're not actually going to be representative of performance in any measurable and repeatable fashion. So before getting to examples of why this game is not reliable to test, here's a quick note. It looks like Hello Games just released an experimental branch of No Man's Sky that's supposed to resolve a few issues. Shader caching will help with the game's intro at least. I'm not sure if that'll help with the gameplay itself, but certainly the intro. And among the stuttering issues, we also had some issues launching the game on different hardware configurations, tested on 3 different machines just to make sure, and saw varied behavior across the board, all Windows 10 by the way. We've seen spurious mouse movements, the FPS cap doesn't work and generally imposes a cap that is not equal to the game's settings. So 30 FPS doesn't equal 30 FPS in the game, and you can't play the game with the monitor configured to a non-native resolution. I know this is a really rare use case, but that's a result of the render setting with how rendering works within the engine. So a lot of small issues and some pretty large issues here. A few of these will be resolved by that experimental branch put out by Hello Games, but we're not testing that yet because it doesn't fix the core issue, which is severe stuttering in actual gameplay. We'll wait for the patch to be ratified until we test for that. So that's the basics. The first chart shows the Titan XP running one test execution, and that's with the game configured to its lowest settings. That's what you're looking at now. Here's a chart for the first test pass. We did multiple. This one is at 1080p measured over a 30-second period. And let's just stress that for a moment. This was only 30 seconds of play. And that's what is normally acceptable for testing, but if you look at multiple passes, these spikes are seen in almost all of them, which means that you should expect to encounter one of these game-interrupting stutters at least once every 30 seconds, if not more. In this instance, we've actually got the Titan XP stalling for a full 100 milliseconds before the next frame is output, and it gets worse from here, by the way, if you hang on a minute. When we discuss frame times, we normally talk about deviation from the mean latency as being the most jarring, i.e. if you move 16 milliseconds from one latency to the next, then that could be pretty noticeable in gameplay and produce a tear. But in this instance, it's blowing out the graph's limitations, so to speak. The result is an output of 138 FPS, but a 36 FPS 0.1% low, and a minimum effectively of 0 for that 100 millisecond period, which really is a pretty long amount of time in a game. This next one shows the second test pass where we go from an average of 6 millisecond frame time to 20 in the worst case scenario. And that's certainly observable, but not nearly as bad as the last time. So the deviation is still exceeding that 8 to 16 millisecond range at times, and that's where you will see some noticeable swings in performance. Our numbers are at least somewhat more consistent here though. Let's look at what happens if we configure the settings to what actually makes sense for a Titan XP. Just a reminder, those were low settings. Here's Ultra with 1080p first. We'll look at the rest later. Notice again that we've got a 100 millisecond spike, dragging our 0.1% lows down to an impressively atrocious 31 FPS. At 4K, we're looking at an output that spikes to 1,000 milliseconds. That's 1 full second. And that means that during gameplay, while walking our fixed and looping and repeated benchmark course, we had a stall where the game effectively froze for a full second. This dragged our 0.1% lows down to 18 FPS, though the minimum value was again 0 FPS for that 1 second period out of the full 30-second benchmark. Let's look at the 980 Ti now before moving to the RX 480, just to make sure this isn't a driver or architecture specific issue. We tested the 980 Ti reference card with low and ultra settings. Looking at low settings, we're seeing spikes hit 40 milliseconds at times in the 30-second test period, resulting in a 2x deviation between the 0.1% lows and the average. The second set of data perfectly illustrates why we've decided against benchmarking this game right now, showing a dip in frame performance from the previous 122 FPS down to 93 FPS, and that's in the second test pass of the same settings, same graphics configuration, and same part of our test course. That's a huge swing, 30 FPS. And these two test passes were conducted within 1 minute of each other in the same area. We see 93 FPS average and 3 FPS 0.1% lows are produced by the outburst of a 4200 millisecond frame latency. And again, that's exactly why we use those low metrics, though here they're really, you need something worse than that. You need actually a minimum for once, because it's not an outlier. And that's because a 93 FPS average looks pretty damn good, aside from the fact that the game was unplayable for 4 seconds out of 30. So 4 seconds out of the 30-second pass, you can't move. That's just, it's effectively lag or stutter, or I think some people call it hitching. Whatever you want to call it, it's not playable. To further diversify architectures, we looked at an MSI RX 480 Gaming X, which is an add-in board partner card, and that's in addition to the 2 reference NVIDIA cards. With low settings, low, at 1080p, we hit one snag of 1500 milliseconds, or 1.5 seconds, and another of 1100 milliseconds, 1.1 second. That was in the same test pass, by the way, with also a 380 millisecond snag, and that's nearly 3 seconds of frozen game time in a 30-second period dispersed across about a 15-second range of testing. So within 15 seconds, you freeze 3 times for periods that are longer than, in some cases, 1 full second. So that's about 10% of the entire 30-second test pass that you can't actually move. In the next pass, we saw better performance, but not much. Snags were at 120 milliseconds, at least it wasn't 1,000, and several were clustered at 60 milliseconds, resulting in a 0.1% low of 19 FPS. Things weren't much better at Ultra either, with a 3 FPS 0.1% low in this test pass, resultant of an 1100 millisecond frame time, followed in sequence by a 500 millisecond frame time, then a 300 millisecond frame time, or latency between frames. So this game, even if you're able to sort of play it just by fighting your way through these things, drop the settings enough that you're only experiencing these 1 second hangs every minute or so. And I know some folks have reported they can play the game. Obviously, this is hugely dependent on hardware, things like that, but we did validate on 3 systems, 2 X99 identical, 100% identical platforms, except for RAM. RAM is different. And 1 Z97 platform with a 4790K. So we've got two 5930Ks, a 4790K. All 3 of those platforms validated the same performance, more or less. And we have 3 different video card architectures, with the Titan X Pascal certainly at the very top end. Even that thing is having trouble with this. A 980 Ti for a last-gen architecture look, just in case, maybe driver maturity, maybe the game developers built on last-gen architecture, certainly within reason. And then, of course, the Polaris card, RX 480, which was an add-in board partner card. So we really did, given how much of a mess this game is right now, we really did cover all the bases just to kind of make sure, okay, is this thing something we can benchmark properly? And the answer was no. Just looking at those 3 cards with the 3 systems, 9 total configurations, we kind of backed away from it and decided, okay, let's see if they actually fix this thing first. Because right now, as you saw in one of those test passes, we had a swing, an average of something like 30 or 40 FPS. And sometimes you have freezes at 0 FPS. So that's not really, here's the thinking, okay? So because of those swings, yes, we could benchmark the game. We could still perform maybe 5 passes even and average the numbers and all of that and say, look, it's really not performing that well right now. But the problem is, because the purpose of a GPU benchmark is to compare one video card to the next for its performance against a competitor or whatever, an add-in board alternative, because that is the purpose, it doesn't make sense to do a benchmark right now of No Man's Sky, because it's really at that point not looking at video card performance, looking at the game's performance, which is dismal. And so to plant cards on a chart, pit them against one another, and declare victors at different settings and resolutions and what have you, is really unfair to the vendors, GPUs, all that, because we're not even looking at isolated GPU performance anymore. We're looking at totally random, spurious FPS output, again, with fluctuations from 6 milliseconds to 4,200 in frame latency. The deviation is just, it's not even it's not an outlier. It's not it's not an outlier because it's happening every single test pass. And sure, sometimes it's 100 milliseconds, but at least 4 of these examples I gave you just now were over 1,000. So the short of it, we're not benchmarking No Man's Sky today. I really wanted to. It's not going to happen because it's not fair to the GPUs and it makes no sense to do so, and we'd just be making stuff up at that point because you're looking at frame rates that don't make sense. So hopefully they fix this. There is a patch forthcoming. The experimental update that's out there right now that you can grab on Steam if you own the game does resolve a few issues like the shader caching, things like that. It does lessen the workload in areas where the workload does not belong, but it doesn't fix everything, and it's experimental, so I'm not showing the results today. We'll look at it once the patch has sort of matured and been ratified into the game code officially and see if things have improved. But for now, on our hardware we tested, it's not playable. I would not recommend playing it. I know some folks, certainly many of you I'm sure, have the game operational to some level. I know I've seen reports of people saying you have to play it for an hour per session and then it will stabilize. That's not acceptable to me, but I'm not telling you don't buy the game. But if you haven't bought it yet, maybe consider waiting a bit. So that's all for this video. As always, Patreon link in the post-roll video to help us out directly. Subscribe. We have some pretty big stuff coming up this week, actually a lot of it, and you don't want to miss that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.